Medieval times weren't just knights and kings. People lived in all kinds of ways, from barely getting by to having more than they could ever use. This is a look at every level of wealth back then, what it meant to have something or nothing. At the very bottom were the ones nobody wanted to be. Beggars existed in a world where every single day was a fight for survival, where the next meal was never guaranteed, and where death could come from hunger, cold, or disease at any moment. These people had absolutely nothing. No land, no job, no family to support them, and no hope of climbing out of their desperate situation. They slept wherever they could find shelter, against church walls, hoping for morning charity, in ditches by the roadside, or huddled near town gates where merchants might toss them scraps. Their bedroom was basically wherever the wind wasn't trying to freeze them to death. Most beggars ended up in this position through terrible luck rather than choice. Some were born with disabilities that made work impossible. Others had been injured in accidents or gotten sick with diseases that left them unable to earn a living. War veterans who lost limbs in battle often found themselves begging because there were no support systems. The daily routine of a beggar was exhausting and dangerous. They would wake up wherever they had managed to sleep and immediately start looking for food. This meant begging at church doors, especially during morning prayers when people felt most generous. They positioned themselves near markets, hoping merchants would give them spoiled food rather than throw it away. Food for beggars was whatever they could get their hands on. Moldy bread, rotten vegetables, scraps from tavern floors, or bones with tiny bits of meat still clinging to them. They weren't exactly dining at five-star restaurants unless you count the dirt floor as ambient lighting. Many suffered from malnutrition, which made them weak and more likely to get sick. Disease spread quickly among beggars because they lived in such terrible conditions. They couldn't afford medicine or even basic health care. A simple cut could become infected and kill them. During plague outbreaks, beggars died in huge numbers because they had no way to protect themselves. People in medieval times had mixed feelings about beggars. Some Christians believed that giving to the poor was a religious duty. However, many townspeople saw beggars as lazy troublemakers who brought crime and disease. The weather was a constant enemy, especially winter when many froze to death. Despite all these hardships, some beggars developed remarkable survival skills. They learned which towns were more generous and when religious festivals meant better charity. But even the smartest beggar faced an almost impossible challenge in trying to escape poverty. However, there were people who managed to earn just slightly more than nothing by working for others. Just above beggars were the landless laborers and servants, people who had managed to secure work but owned practically nothing. These were the human workhorses of medieval society, doing the jobs that nobody else wanted while earning barely enough to survive. Unlike beggars who had to scrounge for every meal, laborers and servants at least knew where their next food was coming from. They worked directly for lords, wealthy farmers, or successful craftsmen in exchange for meals, basic shelter, and sometimes a few coins. It was like having a job where your boss pays you in leftovers and a place to sleep. The work was backbreaking and never-ending. Male laborers spent their days hauling heavy loads, digging ditches, clearing forests, building walls, and mucking out stables. Female servants cleaned houses, cooked meals, washed clothes by hand, and cared for children. Both worked from sunrise to sunset with very few breaks. Their living conditions were only slightly better than sleeping outdoors. Servants often slept in the kitchens or storage rooms of their master's house, sometimes sharing space with animals. Laborers might get a corner of a barn or a tiny shed, barely big enough to lie down in. The food they received was basic but filling. Servants usually ate the same meals as their employers, though they got smaller portions. Laborers might receive bread, porridge, ale, and occasionally some cheese or eggs. It wasn't fancy, but it was regular. These workers were about as replaceable as paper towels. If they got injured, sick, or complained too much, their employers could easily find someone else desperate enough to take their place. This kept wages low and working conditions terrible. Seasonal work was common, especially in farming communities. During planting and harvest seasons, demand for laborers was high, but during winter, many were laid off and had to survive on whatever they had saved or find temporary work elsewhere. Despite the hard work, some laborers and servants were able to save tiny amounts of money over time. A few coins here and there, maybe kept hidden in their clothes or buried somewhere safe, They were basically medieval piggy banks, except the piggy was their pocket and the bank was a hole in the ground. The smart ones learned skills while they worked. A servant might pick up cooking techniques or learn to read and write by watching their master's children get lessons. These skills sometimes help them find better jobs later. While steady work means security, some people yearn for something more: the freedom to make their own deals and choose their own fate. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancée got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Landless peasants occupied a strange middle ground in medieval society. They were technically free people who could move around and make their own decisions, but they owned absolutely no land and had to work other people's property to survive. These peasants were different from laborers and servants because they worked as independent contractors rather than employees. Instead of getting steady meals and shelter, they negotiated deals with landowners to work their fields in exchange for a share of the crops. They were basically medieval freelancers, except instead of working from coffee shops, they worked in muddy fields for grain. The arrangements landless peasants made varied widely depending on who owned the land and how desperate the peasant was for work. Some deals were relatively fair. The peasant might keep half of what they grew. Other agreements were heavily stacked against the worker, with the landowner taking most of the harvest. Their housing situation was precarious because they never knew how long they could stay in one place. Most lived in tiny huts they built themselves using whatever materials they could find: mud, straw, wood scraps, and stones. When a work arrangement ended, they often had to abandon their home and start over somewhere else. Food for landless peasants came mainly from what they could grow or earn through their labor. Their diet consisted mostly of boiled grains like barley or oats, root vegetables, dried beans, and occasionally some eggs or milk. Their meal planning was basically, what didn't die today that I can eat? The uncertainty of their situation created constant stress. Unlike peasants who owned permanent plots, landless peasants never knew if their current arrangement would last through the next season. A landowner might decide to hire someone else or simply kick them out with no notice. Weather and crop failures hit landless peasants especially hard because they had no reserves to fall back on. If the harvest was bad, they might receive barely enough food to survive the winter. If it failed completely, they faced starvation. Many landless peasants traveled constantly, moving from place to place looking for work opportunities. They were like medieval nomads, except instead of following herds of animals, they followed rumors of available farmland. Despite their hardships, landless peasants had more freedom than many other people in medieval society. They weren't tied to a particular lord like serfs were. If they didn't like their current situation, they could pack up and leave to find something better. But not everyone chose the backbreaking path of farming to make their way in the world. Some preferred to earn their living through entirely different means. Minstrels lived one of the most unpredictable lifestyles in medieval times. They could go from performing for kings to sleeping in ditches, depending on their luck and talent. These traveling entertainers made their living through songs, stories, poetry, juggling, and other performances. Unlike peasants who were tied to agricultural work, minstrels had chosen a life of complete uncertainty in exchange for creative freedom. They were basically medieval rock stars, except their tour bus was their own 2 feet, and their recording contract was whatever people felt like tossing into their hat. The life of a minstrel required genuine skill and courage. They had to memorize hundreds of songs and stories, many of which were incredibly long and complex. Popular tales could take hours to tell completely, with intricate plots involving kings, knights, magical creatures, and epic battles. Their instruments were their most valuable possessions and tools of trade. A good lute, harp, or set of pipes could mean the difference between success and failure. Minstrels guarded these instruments carefully because replacing them was expensive and difficult. Travel was constant and dangerous for minstrels. They walked from town to town, castle to castle, and fair to fair, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Roads were full of bandits who saw traveling entertainers as easy targets. Minstrels had to be part performer, part athlete, and part escape artist just to survive getting from one gig to the next. The payment system was completely unpredictable. Sometimes a generous lord would reward a good performance with gold coins, fine clothes, or even a horse. Other times audiences would pay with meals, ale, or simply a warm place to sleep for the night. Minstrels served important functions beyond entertainment in medieval society. They were living newspapers, carrying news and gossip from town to town before printing presses existed. People eagerly gathered around minstrels, not just for entertainment, but to learn what was happening in the wider world. Social acceptance varied wildly, depending on the situation. At royal courts or noble feasts, skilled minstrels were welcome guests. In some towns, however, they were viewed as vagabonds and troublemakers. They were simultaneously loved and hated, like medieval reality TV stars. The competition among minstrels was fierce because there were always more entertainers than paying audiences. To stand out, minstrels specialized in different types of performances. Some focused on heroic ballads, others told romantic stories, or performed comedy acts. Seasonal patterns affected minstrel income dramatically. Summer months were good because people held outdoor festivals and celebrations. Winter was much harder because people stayed indoors and had less money to spend on entertainment. While minstrels lived by their talents and charm, others discovered that true security came from owning something permanent, something no one could take away. Smallholding peasants represented the first rung of people who actually owned something substantial in medieval society, their own small plot of land. This tiny piece of earth, usually just a few acres, was the difference between having some control over their destiny and being completely at the mercy of others. These peasants had managed to either inherit, purchase, or lease small farms that they could call their own. The plots were rarely large enough to make anyone wealthy, but they provided the foundation for a more stable life. They were like medieval homeowners, except their mortgage was paid in sweat and their property taxes came in the form of backbreaking labor. A typical smallholding included a narrow strip of farmland, maybe a small garden area near the house, and space for a few animals. The house itself was usually a simple structure made from whatever materials were available locally: wood planks, mud bricks, stone, or even turf. The daily routine of smallholding peasants revolved completely around their land and animals. They woke up before dawn to milk cows or goats, feed chickens, and check on their crops. Most of their day was spent working in the fields, plowing, planting, weeding, or harvesting, depending on the season. Food production was the main focus because these peasants grew most of what they ate. Their diet was simple but more varied than landless people could afford. They had vegetables from their gardens, grain from their fields, milk and eggs from their animals, and occasionally meat when they slaughtered an older animal. The livestock kept by smallholding peasants was modest but essential. A single cow provided milk and eventually meat. A few chickens gave eggs and could be eaten during special occasions. Some kept goats or pigs, which were easier to feed than cows. Tools and equipment were precious possessions for smallholding peasants. They owned plows, hoes, sickles, axes, and other farming implements that were essential for working their land. Their tool shed was basically their small business inventory. Weather was still a major concern because crop failures could ruin a smallholding peasant's entire year. However, they had some advantages. They could make decisions about what to plant, when to plant it, and how to care for their crops. Trade and bartering were important parts of economic life. They might trade extra vegetables for tools, exchange grain for cloth, or barter services with neighbors. Some sold surplus produce at local markets, earning small amounts of coin. Community relationships were vital because smallholding peasants couldn't afford to hire help during busy seasons. Neighbors worked together during harvest time and helped each other build houses or barns. The neighborhood watch was basically everyone watching everyone else's crops and livestock. The dream of most smallholding peasants was to expand their holdings, buy more land, or see their children advance to better positions in society. Yet owning land came with responsibilities that some found overwhelming: the need to organize others and answer to higher authorities. The position of village reeve was both a blessing and a curse. It offered slightly better living conditions and some authority, but it also made the holder responsible for enforcing unpopular rules and collecting taxes from their own neighbors. Most reeves were selected rather than volunteering for the job. Lords typically chose peasants who could read and write basic numbers, had shown leadership skills, and were trusted by the community. Getting picked as reeve was like being elected class president, except your classmates were armed with farm tools and your job was to make them pay their taxes. The reeve's main responsibilities included organizing farm work on the lord's land, collecting rents and taxes from villagers, settling minor disputes, and reporting problems to higher authorities. During planting and harvest seasons, they coordinated labor crews and made sure work was completed on schedule. Housing for reeves was typically better than average peasant accommodations. They might get a larger house with extra rooms, better construction materials, or prime location within the village. Some lords provided furniture or better cooking equipment that marked the reeves' elevated status. The food situation improved for reeves because they received extra portions of grain, meat, or other supplies as payment for their services. During feast days, reeves often ate at the lord's table or received special dishes not available to ordinary peasants. Authority came with significant challenges for reeves. They had to enforce rules that were often unpopular, such as requiring peasants to work on the lord's fields instead of their own during crucial farming periods. They were basically medieval middle managers, trying to keep everyone happy while following orders from above. Relationships within the village became complicated for reeves. Some peasants resented their authority and accused them of favoritism. Others tried to bribe reeves with gifts to get better work assignments or reduced tax obligations. Record keeping was a crucial part of the job that required basic literacy and math skills. Reeves maintained lists of who lived in the village, what they owed in taxes or labor, when work was completed, and how much grain was harvested. Legal responsibilities included presiding over minor court cases involving village disputes. Reeves heard complaints about stolen chickens, property line disagreements, and petty crimes. They were like medieval judges, except their courtroom was usually under a tree, and their law degree came from life experience. Seasonal pressures were intense for reeves because agricultural work had to be coordinated precisely. During planting season, they organized work crews. Harvest required even more coordination because crops had to be gathered quickly before weather damaged them. The job security of reeves depended entirely on their performance and the lord's satisfaction. A reeve who consistently collected taxes on time and maintained village productivity could hold the position for many years. While reeves gained respect through appointed authority, others sought a different kind of power. Freemen occupied a unique position in medieval society. They were legally free individuals who owned their own property and made their own decisions, but they weren't wealthy enough to be considered upper class. The most important characteristic of freemen was their legal status. Unlike serfs who were bound to their lord's land, freemen could move wherever they wanted, marry whom they chose, and make their own decisions about work and business. They were basically medieval entrepreneurs, except their startup capital was usually a cow and some farming tools. Freemen typically owned small farms, workshops, or shops that provided their income. A freeman farmer might own several fields, a house, barn, and various livestock. Freeman craftsmen owned the tools and materials needed for their trades. Blacksmiths had forges and anvils. Carpenters had saws and chisels. The tax situation for freemen was more complex because they paid money rather than providing labor services. They owed taxes to local lords, fees to use roads and markets, and tithes to the church. Their tax season lasted pretty much all year, since medieval governments were about as efficient at collection as modern ones are at spending. Property rights were real and protected for freemen. They could buy and sell land, pass property to their children, and use their assets as collateral for loans. This security encouraged freemen to invest in improvements to their land and businesses. Business activities for freemen were diverse and often specialized. Some focused on agriculture, growing crops for sale at markets rather than just subsistence. Others learned skilled trades like metalworking, leather crafting, brewing, or textile production. Market participation was crucial for freemen's success. They regularly attended local markets and fairs to sell their products and buy supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Their business networking happened at actual markets instead of coffee shops, and their presentations were just showing people their actual products. Social mobility was possible for freemen in ways that weren't available to lower classes. Successful freemen could accumulate enough wealth to buy more land, expand their businesses, or even purchase minor titles. Political participation was limited but real for freemen. They could vote in town meetings, serve on juries, and participate in local courts. Some were elected to minor civic positions like town watchman or market inspector. Education levels among freemen were higher than among peasants because they needed literacy and math skills for business. Many could read contracts, keep account books, and write letters. Military obligations were part of freeman life because they were expected to serve in local militias. They provided their own weapons and armor, which could be expensive. Housing quality for freemen was noticeably better than peasant accommodations. They could afford large houses with multiple rooms, better construction materials, and more furniture. Some freemen, however, discovered that even greater wealth lay in a different approach. Merchants were the risk-takers of medieval society, people who built their wealth by buying goods in one place and selling them somewhere else for a profit. Their success depended on understanding markets, managing dangerous journeys, and having enough courage to invest their money in ventures that could either make them rich or leave them broke. The merchant lifestyle was fundamentally different from the agricultural focus that dominated most medieval occupations. Instead of growing things or making things, merchants moved things from where they were cheap to where they were expensive. They were basically medieval logistics experts, except their delivery trucks were ox-drawn wagons and their GPS was asking strangers for directions. Successful merchants specialized in different types of goods depending on their location and connections. Some focused on luxury items like spices, silk, or precious metals that were lightweight but extremely valuable. Others dealt in bulk commodities like salt, grain, or wool that were needed in large quantities. Travel was the most dangerous and expensive part of merchant life. Roads were full of bandits who specifically targeted merchant caravans because they carried valuable goods and money. Merchants had to hire guards, pay protection fees to local lords, and sometimes travel in large groups for safety. The equipment needed for merchant ventures was substantial and expensive. They needed sturdy wagons or pack animals to carry goods, weapons for protection, camping supplies for sleeping outdoors, and enough money to buy inventory and pay expenses along the way. Market knowledge was crucial for merchant success. They needed to know which goods were scarce in different cities, when seasonal demand would increase prices, and how political events might affect trade routes. Their market research involved actually going to markets and talking to people instead of reading reports. Credit and banking were essential parts of merchant operations because carrying large amounts of gold and silver was extremely dangerous. Merchants developed sophisticated systems for transferring money and managing international transactions. Seasonal patterns affected merchant activities because weather made travel difficult during certain times of year. Most long-distance trade happened during spring and summer when roads were passable and sailing was safer. Social status for merchants was complicated because they were often wealthier than nobles but didn't have the same legal privileges or social respect. They had more money than knights but couldn't wear fancy clothes or demand the same treatment. Competition among merchants was fierce because successful trade routes attracted multiple operators. Merchants had to offer better prices, faster delivery, higher quality goods, or superior service to win customers. Risk management was a constant concern because so many things could go wrong. Weather could delay shipments, wars could close trade routes, customers could refuse to pay, and thieves could steal entire inventories. The most successful merchants accumulated enough wealth to live like minor nobles, with fine houses, expensive clothes, and servants. Some used their wealth to buy land and eventually transition into the landed gentry. But not everyone was willing to risk their wealth on honest trade. Robber barons chose a dangerous path to wealth by controlling strategic locations and demanding payment from anyone who wanted to pass through safely. These were usually minor nobles or ambitious commoners who decided that taking money by force was easier than earning it through honest work. Unlike random bandits hiding in forests, robber barons operated sophisticated criminal enterprises. They built or seized castles, towers, or fortified positions that gave them control over valuable trade routes, river crossings, or mountain passes. They ran medieval toll booths, except instead of taking coins, they took whatever they wanted at sword point. Location was everything for robber baron success. A well-positioned castle or tower could control miles of territory and generate enormous income from forced tolls. The best spots were places where geography naturally funneled traffic. Narrow valleys, the only bridge across a river, or passes through mountain ranges. The business model was surprisingly sophisticated for what was essentially organized crime. Robber barons identified valuable trade routes, studied travel patterns, and calculated how much they could steal without completely killing the trade that made their operations profitable. Military organization was essential because robber barons needed enough armed men to intimidate travelers, but not so many that the costs ate up all their profits. A typical operation might include 20 to 50 fighters, along with servants and guards. Revenue streams extended beyond simple highway robbery. They might demand regular tribute from nearby villages, ransom prisoners for substantial payments, or sell protection services to merchants who wanted guaranteed safe passage. Their business plan was basically find creative ways to separate people from their money without actually working for it. Relationships with legitimate authorities were complex and constantly changing. Some robber barons had informal agreements with local lords who received shares of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. The lifestyle of successful robber barons could be quite luxurious, at least temporarily. They lived in fortified castles with all the comforts that stolen wealth could buy: fine food, expensive clothes, weapons, horses, and entertainment. Social acceptance varied dramatically depending on local politics. In some areas, robber barons were seen as rebels fighting against oppressive rulers. In others, they were viewed as dangerous criminals who made life miserable for everyone. The risk-to-reward ratio was extreme for robber barons. Successful operations could generate wealth comparable to major merchants, but failure often meant death, exile, or losing everything. The most successful robber barons eventually transitioned to legitimate roles by using their wealth and military experience to serve established rulers. Some became generals or governors. The key was knowing when to stop robbing and start negotiating. However, the military skills that made robber barons successful were exactly the same talents that legitimate rulers valued in their service. Knights represented the warrior aristocracy of medieval society. Professional soldiers who received land grants in exchange for military service to their lords. They were expected to be masters of warfare, exemplars of Christian virtue, and leaders of rural communities. The path to knighthood usually began in childhood when boys from noble or wealthy families were sent to serve as pages in other households. They started their military careers as medieval apprentices, except instead of learning to fix things, they learned to break them with style. Training was intense and comprehensive, covering not just fighting skills, but also hunting, riding, courtly behavior, and basic education. Young men spent years learning to fight with swords, lances, maces, and other weapons while wearing heavy armor. The investment required to become and remain a knight was enormous. A full set of armor, weapons, and war horses could cost as much as a small village, and these items needed constant maintenance and replacement. Land ownership was the foundation of knight economic life because agricultural income supported their expensive military lifestyle. A knight's estate might include several villages, hundreds of peasants, mills, forests, and other resources that generated the wealth needed to maintain horses, weapons, and armor. Military obligations were the core of knight responsibility. They owed their lord a specific number of days of military service each year, usually around 40 days, though this could be extended during major campaigns. The code of chivalry was supposed to govern knight behavior, emphasizing courage, honor, protection of the weak, and Christian virtue. In practice, knights varied widely in how seriously they took these ideals. Some were genuinely heroic figures, while others were basically heavily armed bullies with fancy titles. Social relationships for knights were complex because they occupied middle positions in the feudal hierarchy. They owed loyalty to higher nobles while expecting the same from people on their lands. Economic pressures on knights increased over time as warfare became more expensive and agricultural income failed to keep pace with military costs. They were like military contractors whose government contracts didn't always cover their actual expenses. Tournament culture provided opportunities for knights to practice their skills, gain reputation, and win prizes during peacetime. These events were part sporting competition, part military training, and part social gathering. Religious duties were an important part of knight identity because they were expected to be Christian warriors who defended the faith. Some knights joined crusades to the Holy Land, while others fought against Muslims in Spain. Legal privileges included the right to bear arms, hold land directly from higher nobles, and participate in noble courts. They were exempt from many taxes and could only be judged by other nobles. The rise of professional armies gradually reduced the military importance of knights, though their social status remained high. Many adapted by becoming court officials or military commanders. However, the responsibilities and costs of nightlife sometimes seem modest compared to those who controlled multiple estates and commanded several knights at once. Barons were major landowners who controlled vast territories and wielded significant political power within their regions. They owned multiple estates, commanded dozens or hundreds of knights, and served as key advisors to kings and dukes. The typical baron controlled several manors, each centered around a fortified castle or manor house. These estates might be scattered across different regions, requiring sophisticated management systems to collect rents, oversee agricultural production, and maintain military forces. Administrative complexity was enormous because barons had to coordinate activities across multiple properties while fulfilling obligations to higher authorities and managing relationships with subordinate knights. Most employed stewards, bailiffs, and clerks to handle day-to-day operations. Military power was the foundation of baron authority. They commanded feudal armies that included their own household knights, forces provided by subordinate nobles, and soldiers recruited from their lands. Their staff meetings were basically war councils with better food. Castle construction and maintenance consumed significant portions of baron wealth because these fortifications were essential for controlling territory and demonstrating power. A typical baron owned several castles of varying sizes. Political influence allowed barons to shape laws, policies, and decisions that affected entire kingdoms. They served on royal councils, participated in important court ceremonies, and often acted as regional governors. Economic resources came from multiple sources, including agricultural rents, taxes on trade, fees for using mills and markets, judicial fines, and profits from mining or forestry operations on their lands. Social obligations required barons to maintain elaborate households that reflected their status and provided hospitality to guests, allies, and subordinates. A baron's court might include dozens of knights, officials, servants, entertainers, and visitors. Marriage alliances were crucial because these relationships determined political partnerships, territorial expansion, and inheritance patterns. Baron marriages were major political events that could reshape regional power balances. Legal authority gave barons the right to hold courts, judge criminal cases, and impose punishments, including imprisonment or execution. They appointed local officials and controlled access to important resources. Religious patronage was expected from barons who were supposed to support churches, monasteries, and religious institutions on their lands. Many founded religious houses or participated in crusades. The most successful barons accumulated enough power and wealth to challenge royal authority or establish their own quasi-independent states. They were like medieval CEOs who decided their companies were big enough to become their own countries. However, some individuals achieved even greater influence through religious rather than purely secular authority. Dukes represented the highest level of nobility below royalty, controlling vast regions that might include dozens of baronies, hundreds of manors, and populations of hundreds of thousands of people. Their power and wealth were so substantial that they often functioned as independent rulers within their territories. The territories controlled by dukes were typically entire provinces or regions with distinct cultural and economic identities. A duchy might encompass major cities, important trade routes, valuable natural resources, and strategic military positions. They were basically running their own countries, except they still had to pretend the king was in charge at formal dinner parties. Administrative systems in duchies were sophisticated governmental structures that rivaled royal administrations. Dukes employed hundreds of officials, including stewards, treasurers, judges, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives. Military forces under ducal command were substantial armies that could determine the outcomes of major wars. A powerful duke might command several thousand knights, tens of thousands of foot soldiers, and significant numbers of archers and siege engineers. Economic power came from controlling major sources of wealth, including agricultural production from vast estates, taxes on trade through important commercial centers, profits from mining operations, and fees from judicial and administrative services. Political influence extended far beyond their own territories because dukes were major advisors to kings, leaders of noble factions, and key figures in succession disputes. They arranged marriages between royal families and negotiated international treaties. Court culture in ducal palaces was elaborate and sophisticated, often surpassing royal courts in luxury and artistic achievement. Dukes competed with each other and with kings to attract the best artists, scholars, musicians, and poets. Diplomatic relationships were complex because dukes had to balance loyalty to their kings with their own territorial interests, relationships with foreign powers, and obligations to subordinate nobles. Legal systems in duchies were comprehensive governmental structures that included multiple levels of courts, complex legal codes, and extensive bureaucracies for enforcing laws and collecting taxes. Marriage strategies for ducal families involved international negotiations that could reshape the political map of Europe. Ducal marriages were major diplomatic events that created alliances between kingdoms. The most powerful dukes accumulated enough authority to challenge royal power directly, sometimes becoming kings themselves through conquest, marriage, or political maneuvering. They were like regional managers who decided they were qualified to run the entire company. Yet even ducal power could be overshadowed by those who commanded spiritual rather than temporal authority over the faithful. Bishops wielded a unique combination of spiritual authority and temporal power that made them among the most influential people in medieval society. They controlled vast church lands, commanded enormous wealth, and exercised religious authority over hundreds of thousands of believers. The religious authority of bishops was absolute within their dioceses, giving them power over the spiritual lives of everyone from peasants to nobles. They controlled access to sacraments, determined religious doctrine, and could excommunicate people who defied church authority. They were like medieval CEOs of salvation, with the power to fire people from eternal happiness. Territorial control by bishops often rivaled that of secular nobles because the church owned enormous amounts of land donated by faithful believers over centuries. A typical bishop controlled hundreds of manors, dozens of monasteries, and significant urban properties. Administrative complexity in church governance required sophisticated bureaucratic systems to manage religious, legal, and economic affairs across large territories. Bishops employed hundreds of clerks, lawyers, accountants, and administrators. Economic resources available to bishops came from multiple sources, including tithes paid by all Christians, donations from wealthy believers, profits from church lands, fees for religious services, and income from pilgrimage sites. Political influence was enormous because bishops served as advisors to kings, participated in royal councils, and often held important government positions. Their political networking happened at places where everyone was required to show up every week and listen to them talk. Legal authority extended beyond religious matters because bishops controlled church courts that handled marriage disputes, inheritance cases involving church property, and crimes committed by clergy. Educational leadership was central to bishop responsibilities because the church controlled most schools, libraries, and centers of learning. Bishops determined curriculum, appointed teachers, and influenced intellectual development throughout their regions. Military power was significant for bishops who controlled fortified cities, maintained armed guards, and sometimes led armies in defense of church interests. While bishops weren't supposed to shed blood personally, they often commanded military forces. Cultural patronage by bishops supported artistic and intellectual achievements that influenced European civilization for centuries. They commissioned magnificent cathedrals, supported scholars and artists, and preserved classical learning. Daily responsibilities included conducting religious ceremonies, administering church business, hearing legal cases, managing properties, and maintaining relationships with secular and religious authorities. The most powerful bishops accumulated influence that rivaled or exceeded that of kings, especially in regions where church authority was particularly strong. Some became de facto rulers of independent territories. However, even bishops had to respect the financial power of those who controlled the flow of money itself. Bankers occupied a unique and often dangerous position in medieval society. They were among the wealthiest individuals of their time, yet they were frequently despised and sometimes killed by the very people who depended on their financial services. The banking business was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Bankers developed complex systems for transferring money across vast distances, managing international currency exchanges, and providing credit for major commercial and political ventures. They were running medieval Wall Street, except their biggest worry wasn't market crashes, but actual mobs with pitchforks. Capital accumulation for bankers began with modest money-changing operations in market towns, where they exchanged different types of coins and provided basic financial services to merchants. Successful money changers gradually expanded into lending operations and major banking houses. International operations were essential for banking success because the most profitable opportunities involve financing long-distance trade, managing currency exchanges between different regions, and providing credit for ventures that cross political boundaries. Risk management was crucial for banker survival because their business involved enormous potential losses from bad loans, currency fluctuations, political upheavals, and default by borrowers. Their risk assessment basically consisted of figuring out which kings were likely to pay back their loans versus which ones might just execute them instead. Political relationships were both essential and dangerous because bankers often lent money to kings and nobles who had the power to cancel debts, seize assets, or simply kill their creditors when repayment became inconvenient. Religious persecution was a constant threat for many bankers, especially those who were Jewish, because church law prohibited Christians from charging interest on loans. This created opportunities for non-Christian bankers, but also made them vulnerable to persecution and violence. Urban development was significantly influenced by banker investments because they had the capital needed for major infrastructure projects, real estate development, and commercial ventures that shaped the growth of medieval cities. Family business structures were common because trust was essential in financial operations, and family members were more reliable than outside partners. Many banking dynasties lasted for generations. Legal challenges faced by bankers included complex inheritance laws, different legal systems in various jurisdictions, and the constant threat of debt cancellation by powerful borrowers. Cultural impact of banking extended beyond purely economic matters because wealthy bankers became major patrons of art, architecture, and learning. Banking families funded magnificent palaces and sponsored artists and scholars. The most successful bankers accumulated so much wealth and influence that they could determine the fate of kingdoms, though their power ultimately depended on the favor of those who claimed divine authority to rule. Kings stood at the apex of medieval society, wielding absolute authority over their realms and controlling resources that dwarfed even the wealthiest nobles and bankers. They claimed divine right to rule, commanded vast armies, and lived in luxury that was literally unimaginable to most of their subjects. The wealth of medieval kings was theoretically unlimited because they legally owned all land in their kingdoms and could demand taxes, tribute, and military service from everyone under their authority. They were the ultimate landlords, except their rental agreements were enforced by armies instead of lawyers. Royal administration required massive bureaucratic systems to govern territories that might span hundreds of thousands of square miles and millions of people. Kings employed thousands of officials, including stewards, treasurers, judges, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives. Military power was the foundation of royal authority because kings needed armies to defend against foreign invasion, suppress internal rebellions, and enforce their will throughout their territories. Royal armies included professional soldiers, feudal levies from noble vassals, and mercenary forces. Economic control extended to every aspect of commerce and production within royal territories. Kings minted coins, regulated trade, collected customs duties, and controlled access to valuable resources like forests, mines, and fishing rights. Political authority was absolute in theory, but required constant negotiation with powerful nobles, church leaders, and wealthy merchants who had their own sources of power and influence. Successful kings learned to balance competing interests while maintaining their supreme authority. Legal systems throughout kingdoms were controlled by royal courts that interpreted laws, judged criminal cases, and resolved disputes involving major property or political issues. Kings had the power to create laws, grant pardons, and impose punishments up to and including execution. Diplomatic relationships with foreign rulers were crucial for royal success because medieval kingdoms existed in a complex web of alliances, trade agreements, marriage contracts, and territorial disputes. Religious authority was closely connected to royal power because kings claimed divine sanction for their rule and often controlled important church appointments and religious policies. The relationship between royal and papal authority was a source of constant tension. Cultural leadership was expected from kings who were supposed to embody the highest ideals of their civilization and support artistic, intellectual, and architectural achievements that reflected royal glory. Marriage strategies for royal families were major political events that could reshape the map of Europe through alliances, inheritance claims, and territorial transfers. Royal marriages were negotiated like international treaties. Daily life for kings involved constant ceremonial duties, administrative responsibilities, military planning, and political negotiations. They lived in magnificent palaces surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, servants, guards, and advisors. Succession disputes were among the most dangerous threats to royal authority because unclear inheritance laws, competing claimants, and ambitious nobles could trigger civil wars that destroyed entire kingdoms. Their estate planning was basically, hope nobody kills me before I figure out who should inherit everything. Justice administration was a major royal responsibility because people expected kings to provide fair legal systems and protection from crime and oppression. Royal courts handled the most important legal cases. Financial management for royal treasuries required sophisticated accounting systems and careful planning because kings had enormous expenses for military forces, administrative bureaucracies, diplomatic missions, and ceremonial requirements. Personal security was a constant concern because kings faced threats from assassins, rebels, foreign enemies, and ambitious relatives who might want to seize the throne. Royal palaces were heavily fortified, and kings were surrounded by guards. The most successful kings built dynasties that lasted for centuries, expanded their territories through conquest and diplomacy, and left legacies that influenced the development of entire civilizations. They accumulated wealth and power that seemed almost godlike to their contemporaries. From the desperate beggars sleeping in ditches to the mighty kings ruling from golden thrones, medieval society was a complex hierarchy where birth, luck, skill, and sometimes violence determined whether someone lived in luxury or died in poverty. Each level brought its own challenges and opportunities, but the gap between the top and bottom was so vast that they might as well have been living in completely different worlds.